The last time I heard soldiers laugh at human myths, the emergency lights turned red 12 seconds later. That is not dramatic timing. That is not a storyteller's trick. That is the exact number from the station clock, burned into my memory with the kind of precision trauma gives you for free. We were packed into Briefing Room 7 aboard the Coalition carrier Iron Halo, 43 combat personnel from 9 species, all of us waiting for a threat assessment that was already 6 minutes late. 6 minutes is nothing in civilian life. In the military, 6 minutes is enough time for bored soldiers to become philosophers, comedians, and idiots. Mostly idiots. Someone had pulled up a human mythology file on the central display, and by the time I arrived, half the room was laughing at it. Not smiling. Not politely amused. Laughing. Shoulder plates shaking. Mandibles clicking. Breathing sacs wheezing. Full barracks laughter. The file title read Terran Battlefield Legends, and under it were the usual ridiculous claims the galaxy loved to repeat when humans were not in the room. One human held a mountain pass for 3 days. One human pilot flew through an asteroid field with no guidance system. One human captain walked into a dead zone and came back with an enemy flag under his arm. You understand why we laughed. Look at a human sometime. Really look. Soft skin. 2 eyes. No natural armor. No visible claws. Their teeth look like an unfinished committee project. They sweat when nervous, hungry, tired, warm, cold, embarrassed, or apparently just alive. One recruit from my unit, a young Threxian named Jero, zoomed in on an image of a human marine from some old Earth campaign and nearly fell out of his chair. The creature in the picture was maybe 6 feet tall, wrapped in fabric and confidence, standing beside alien soldiers twice his mass. That, Jero said, tapping the display, is supposed to be the monster of Black Meridian? The room broke again. I laughed too. I will not pretend I was wiser than the rest of them. I had fought pirates off the rings of Kaldor. I had survived vacuum drills, boarding simulations, and one Thanksgiving dinner with a human logistics officer who insisted cranberry sauce was food. I thought I understood humans. Tough for their size, yes. Stubborn, definitely. Weirdly cheerful under pressure, absolutely. But monsters? No. Monsters do not say excuse me when reaching past you for coffee. Monsters do not label their emergency repair kits with little smiley faces. Monsters do not complain that military rations need hot sauce. At the back of the room, an old human sat alone with a paper cup in his hand. Paper. On a starship. Like we were in some roadside diner in Kansas. He wore a faded Terran Marine jacket with no medals displayed, no weapon, no dramatic scar across his face, nothing that announced importance. Gray touched his dark hair at the temples. His boots were polished but old. His eyes stayed on the floor while the room mocked his species. I assumed he was maintenance. Maybe advisory staff. Maybe one of those human morale officers who told uncomfortable jokes and fixed broken machines by hitting them. Jero noticed him too and raised his voice. Hey, Earthman, is it true one of you scared an empire with a pocket knife and a bad attitude? More laughter. The human lifted his cup, took one slow sip, and did not answer. That should have bothered me. It did not. Not yet. Then the main door opened, and Colonel Varick entered like a storm, wearing rank pins. Every soldier snapped upright except the human in the back. The colonel's 4 eyes swept the room, found the display, then found the old man. His face changed. Not much. Just enough. The kind of change veterans make when a joke walks too close to a grave. The laughter died in pieces. Colonel Varick stood straighter than I had ever seen him stand, and said, very carefully, Captain Mason Reed, I did not know you had arrived. The old human looked up at last. Traffic was light, he said. That was when the alarm screamed. Red light flooded the room. The carrier shuddered beneath our boots. The myth file vanished, replaced by a live tactical warning, and suddenly nobody was laughing at humans anymore. For 3 seconds, every soldier in Briefing Room 7 became exactly what training manuals pretend soldiers never become. Confused. Silent. Waiting for someone else to understand first. The red tactical warning pulsed across the wall display, painting our armor, our faces, and Captain Mason Reed's old jacket in the same emergency color. Then Colonel Varick barked for status, and the room remembered how to breathe. Screens snapped awake. Communications officers shouted over one another. The carrier Iron Halo rolled slightly beneath us, not enough to throw anyone down, just enough to remind every living thing aboard that something outside had touched our defensive perimeter. I checked my wrist display and saw the alert classification. Unknown formation. High-speed approach. No active identification beacon. Distance, 9,000 miles and closing. That was when my stomach went cold. Not because of the contact. We had seen unidentified ships before. Pirates forgot their beacons. Smugglers spoofed signatures. Mining crews got drunk and flew expensive machines like rented scooters. No, what bothered me was Colonel Varick's face. He was not looking at the incoming formation. He was looking at the human. Captain Reed set his paper cup on the small table beside him with almost insulting care. Not fast. Not dramatic. He placed it down like a man who refused to spill coffee during an apocalypse, because that would be rude. How many? He asked. Nobody answered him at first, because nobody understood why the maintenance-looking human in the back was asking command-level questions. Then the tactical officer swallowed hard. 7 contacts, sir. Maybe 8. Their signals are folding in and out. Captain Reed nodded once, as if someone had confirmed the weather. Jairo, who had been laughing the loudest minutes earlier, leaned toward me and whispered, "Why is everyone listening to him?" I wanted to tell him they were not. I wanted to say this was human weirdness. One of those moments where they walked into a serious situation with farmer confidence and diner manners. But Colonel Varick had not moved. His shoulders were locked. His lower hands were closed so tightly the joints had gone pale. That is when I remembered the file we had been mocking. Not the funny parts. Not the ridiculous claims. The footnotes. Redacted. Operation names. Missing mission dates. Survivor testimony sealed by coalition intelligence. The legends had always sounded too clean to be real, too simple, too perfectly shaped for recruits and campfire stories. One human held a pass. One human crossed a dead zone. One human made an enemy commander surrender by asking for terms in a calm voice. We called them myths because myths were easier to store than uncomfortable facts. Every military has stories like that. Every species exaggerates. My people once claimed a single Varan scout scared off a raider fleet by standing on a hill and raising one flag. In reality, the scout had excellent artillery support and a very lucky weather pattern. So when humans told stories about impossible last stands and impossible marches and impossible survival, we placed them in the same mental cabinet. Morale fiction, cultural pride, the emotional decoration of a young species desperate to look bigger in a galaxy that measured power by tonnage and fleet count. But Captain Reed did not look desperate. He did not look proud either. That was worse. He looked tired in the way old bridges look tired, still standing after storms that should have taken them down. The display flickered again, and a new symbol appeared beside the approaching contacts. No one laughed this time. The symbol was not complete, just a partial match dragged from an old battlefield database. But Colonel Varick saw it and whispered something I had never heard from him before. A prayer. Captain Reed finally stood. He was only about 6 feet tall, maybe 180 pounds, smaller than half the soldiers in that room. Yet when he stepped toward the tactical table, everyone moved out of his way. Not because he ordered us to. Because fear has instincts rank cannot teach. He looked at the symbol, then at us, the same soldiers who had mocked his species 12 seconds earlier. "You were reading the children's version," he said quietly. The strangest thing about Captain Mason Reed was not that he looked ordinary. It was that every dangerous person in the room suddenly pretended he was not. Colonel Varick stepped aside from the tactical table, and that alone should have set off every alarm in my skull. Varick did not step aside for admirals. He made admirals walk around him. Yet for this old human in a faded jacket, he moved like a private making space for a legend. Captain Reed leaned over the display, hands resting flat on the edge. Human hands always looked unfinished to me. 5 fingers. Soft skin. No talents. No defensive ridges. The sort of hands you expected to see repairing a kitchen sink in Ohio, not studying an enemy formation that had just sent a coalition carrier into full alert. Then I noticed the small details I had missed before. His left sleeve had a stitched patch shaped like a black star over a silver ridge. Not decoration. Unit history. His jacket collar was worn smooth where armor seals had once locked into place. His boots had been resoled so many times the original pattern was nearly gone, but they were still polished with the stubborn care of a man who remembered inspections from 40 years ago. Nothing about him was flashy. That made it worse. Jero whispered again, quieter now. Is he really a captain? Across the table, Lieutenant Saren heard him and gave a nervous little click. Rank does not always retire at the same speed as reputation. That sounded wise. It was also the kind of sentence soldiers use when they are trying not to admit they are scared. Captain Reed tapped the display twice. Their approach angle is wrong. The tactical officer blinked. Wrong how, sir? Reed pointed to the formation. 7 pale marks moving through the dark grid outside our perimeter. They are not coming straight at the carrier. They are coming at where your escape vector will be in 4 minutes. The room went still in a new way. Not silent from confusion. Silent from understanding. We were not being charged. We were being herded. Colonel Varick turned toward the navigation crew. Confirm. The answer came back fast and thin. Confirmed. If we follow standard evasive pattern, we cross that intercept lane. Jero's throat plate shifted. Mine did too. The human had seen in 10 seconds what our combat system had not flagged yet. Reed did not smile. He did not look pleased. Humans in stories always grinned before doing impossible things. This one looked like he had just found mildew in a basement. Annoyed. Familiar with the problem. Mildly disappointed it had come back. They learned, he said. Colonel Varick's voice dropped. From Black Meridian? Reed looked at him for half a second. From what survived it. Nobody asked what that meant. Nobody wanted the full answer. The display requested command authorization to open sealed records. Colonel Varick entered his code. Denied. He entered a second code. Denied again. Then Captain Reed reached into his jacket and pulled out a small metal tag on a chain. Not a weapon. Not a badge. Just an old Terran identity tag, scratched almost white at the edges. He held it against the scanner. The system paused for so long I thought it had frozen. Then every screen in briefing room 7 changed color from red to white. Access granted. Priority level, Meridian witness. That was the moment the room finally understood the first terrible truth. Captain Mason Reed had not been invited to brief us about a myth. He was the reason the myth had a security clearance. The white screens did something worse than show classified files. They showed our own laughter reflected back at us in official language. The first record opened with a clean coalition summary, the kind written by someone far from danger with polished grammar and no mud on their boots. Incident: Black Meridian defensive action. Human participation: limited. Strategic value: disputed. Recommended distribution: restricted training archive. That was the version recruits heard in briefings. That was the version we had turned into jokes. Captain Reed read it without expression, then reached forward and swiped the page away. Underneath, it was the original transmission log, time-stamped 42 years earlier, recorded from a colonial relay station near the Meridian Ridge. The audio was damaged. The video was worse. Not bloody, not dramatic, just broken by static and emergency distortion, which somehow made it feel more real. A younger Mason Reed appeared on the screen, helmet tucked under one arm, face covered in dust, standing inside what looked like a command shelter made from cargo. Plates in bad luck. Behind him, lights flickered. Somewhere beyond the camera, alarms sounded in short, tired bursts. The young human looked straight into the recorder and said, "We are still here." That was all. 4 words. No speech. No heroic music. No wild promise. Just a status update from a man the galaxy later turned into a campfire monster because the truth was too heavy to carry. Jero did not whisper this time. He barely breathed. Lieutenant Saren looked away first. That surprised me. Saren had once watched a reactor containment drill fail and only complained about the paperwork. Captain Reed closed the log before anyone could ask for more. That sentence became your myth, he said. His voice stayed even, almost gentle. One human held a mountain pass. That is what they told you, correct? No one answered. We all knew the answer. We had been laughing at that exact line less than 5 minutes earlier. Reed nodded as if silence was confirmation enough. That line was written for children, politicians, and nervous allies. Colonel Varick folded all 4 hands behind his back. Captain, the incoming formation is continuing to close. 6,000 miles. Reed glanced at the display. Plenty of time to stop lying to them. That sentence hit harder than the alarm. He turned from the table and looked at us. Not like a teacher, not like a commander, but like a man deciding whether we were old enough for the adult version of a story. At Black Meridian, the ridge was not held by one human. It was held by one human company after every automated defense failed, every evacuation route collapsed, and every sensible tactical model said withdrawal was the only rational choice. Jero found his courage in the worst possible way. So the myth exaggerated the retreat? Reed looked at him. Not angry. Worse. Patient. No. The room seemed to shrink around that word. Reed turned back to the incoming contacts. The myth exaggerated how much help we had. Somewhere behind me, a soldier made a small sound and immediately swallowed it. The enemy symbols on the screen shifted formation again, sliding into a crescent pattern. Our combat system labeled it inefficient. Captain Reed labeled it from memory. They are trying to scare you into moving early. Colonel Varick asked, and if we do not move? Reed picked up his coffee, remembered it was empty, and set it down with quiet disappointment. Then they learned whether the second myth was also too small. Colonel Varick did not ask what the second myth was. That told me he already knew, which told me I absolutely did not want to know. The iron halo trembled again, a deep vibration under the deck plates, the kind that traveled through boots and bones, and made every soldier suddenly aware of how much empty space surrounded a ship. The tactical officer called out distance updates with a voice that kept getting thinner. 5,000 miles. 4,800. 4,600. Captain Mason Reed listened like a man hearing rain against a window. Then he pointed at 3 stations without looking at their operators. Cut the automatic evasive pattern. Lock attitude control. Keep the carrier nose on for another 90 seconds. The navigation chief stared at him. Sir, that violates coalition survival doctrine. Reed nodded. Yes. That was the entire answer. Just yes. Jero looked at me with wide eyes, silently asking whether humans were allowed to do that, as if I had suddenly become an expert in Terran military law. I was not. I was an expert in regretting jokes. Colonel Varick gave the order himself. Manual hold. Nose on. 90 seconds. Across the room, soldiers obeyed, but the air changed. We were no longer mocking myths. We were standing inside one while an old human gave instructions that sounded like bad ideas until the ship followed them and did not explode. The incoming formation reacted almost immediately. Their crescent broke apart. Not fully, just a twitch in the pattern, like a predator realizing the prey had not run in the expected direction. Reed saw it. So did Varick. So did every system on the table, 3 seconds late. There, Reed said. They are impatient. Lieutenant Saren finally found enough nerve to speak. Captain Reed, what are they? Reed looked at the partial symbol still blinking beside the contact group. A lesson that should have stayed. Learned. Nobody liked that. Soldiers prefer enemies with names, shapes, ranges, and weaknesses. We like problems that fit on a training slide. This did not. This was a ghost wearing a radar signature. Colonel Varick lowered his voice. Tell them enough to keep them alive. Reed gave him a tired glance. That is a narrow amount. It should have sounded arrogant. It did not. It sounded accurate. He turned to us, and for the first time I understood why the colonel had gone so still when he recognized him. Reed did not carry command like rank. He carried it like a memory everyone else was late to share. You heard 3 myths today, he said. The mountain pass. The dead zone. The surrender message. Jero swallowed. The pocket knife story. Reed looked at him for one long second. That was not mine. Relief passed across Jero's face. Poor Jero. He thought he had found proof that at least one legend was nonsense. Reed continued. That was Sergeant Maria Cole. She was funnier than me. The relief disappeared. Fast. Clean. Gone. A few soldiers shifted in their seats. Someone at the back whispered an apology to no one in particular. Reed ignored it, which made it worse. The contact distance dropped below 4,000 miles. Our defensive batteries tracked, but did not fire. The carrier waited, held steady against every instinct we had been trained to trust. Reed raised one hand, palm down, telling the room to stay calm without using the word calm. The stories you laugh at were not made to make humans look brave, he said. They were made to make everyone else keep functioning after reading the reports. The main display flashed again. The enemy formation vanished from long-range sensors for half a second, then reappeared closer. Much closer. A sound moved through the room. Not panic. Not yet. The step before panic. Reed turned back to the table and asked, almost politely, Do your point defense guns have manual sights? The weapons officer blinked. Yes, sir. but no one uses them outside museum drills. Captain Reed rolled his shoulders once, as if loosening an old ache. Then today is going to be educational. The weapons officer transferred point defense control to manual, and every console in briefing room 7 complained like an old machine being asked to remember its youth. Warning banners stacked across the display. Accuracy reduction. Human input delay risk. Coalition doctrine violation. Captain Mason Reed read them with the mild interest of a man comparing cereal labels at a grocery store. Turn those off, he said. The officer hesitated. Colonel Varick did not. Silence advisory warnings. The room became quieter, which was somehow worse. Without the warnings, all we had left was the low thrum of the carrier, the distance counter, and the old human breathing steadily beside the tactical table. Reed asked for a weapons overlay. Blue lines appeared across the display, showing the Iron Halo's defensive arcs. He studied them for maybe 4 seconds. For seconds, I had spent 3 years learning coalition defensive geometry, and this human looked at our carrier like a truck driver checking a side mirror. Your lower starboard arc is lazy, he said. The weapons officer stiffened. That battery passed inspection yesterday. I did not say it was broken. I said it was lazy. He tapped the screen. It turned 7 degrees slower than the others. They will test that side first. No one argued this time. That was how far we had fallen in 10 minutes. We had gone from laughing at human stories to accepting equipment criticism from a man holding an empty coffee cup. Jero leaned closer to me and whispered, "How does he know?" I whispered back, "I think he has been here before." It was a stupid answer. It was also the only one I had. The enemy contacts separated into pairs, then folded back into a loose spiral. Our system labeled it unpredictable. Reed labeled it bait. He ordered the carrier to keep its nose steady, then told the manual gunners to ignore the closest contact. That nearly broke the room. Ignoring the closest threat is not courage. It is usually how training videos begin before the instructor pauses and says, "Notice the fatal error." Lieutenant Sarin could not stop himself. "Captain, standard response says we engage the lead contact." Reed did not look away from the display. That is why it is leading. A small, embarrassed silence followed. The kind you get when a very old person explains something obvious, and everyone younger realizes technology made them lazy. Then Reed did something that made my skin tighten. He asked Colonel Varick to open the second Meridian file. The colonel's jaw set. Is that necessary? They need to know what not to believe. The file opened without video. Just a transcript, old audio converted into plain text. At the top were 6 words, human account considered psychologically distorted. Jero read that line and almost relaxed. I saw it happen. Several others did too. There it was, the escape hatch we wanted. Distorted account. Faulty memory. Battlefield stress. Maybe the legends really were exaggerated. Maybe Captain Reed was only useful because he had survived something terrible, not because the terrible thing had been real. Reed let us have that comfort for exactly 1 breath. That label was added by analysts who were not there, he said. They thought the report was impossible because the numbers did not fit their models. The carrier shook as something flashed across our outer sensor net and vanished. The lower starboard battery began to rotate. Slowly, 7 degrees behind the others. The weapons officer turned pale. Reed pointed at the lazy arc. Manual gun 3, do not track the target. Track the empty space behind it. The gunner obeyed. For the first time, the enemy spiral faltered. Reed finally said the sentence Colonel Varick had been dreading. The myth was wrong. Around me, soldiers drew in breath, almost relieved. Then the human finished. Black Meridian was not a last stand. It was a warning shot. No one in briefing room 7 understood the phrase warning shot the same way. To my species, it meant a harmless discharge across open space. To the coalition, it meant diplomacy with noise. To Captain Mason Reed, it apparently meant an event so severe that 42 years later, an enemy formation still remembered the angle of his ship. The tactical display showed manual gun 3 holding steady on empty space. Empty space is a difficult target to respect. Soldiers like objects. We like coordinates, hull shapes, heat blooms. Something we can point at and say, there, that is the problem. Reed had pointed at nothing. Then nothing moved. A distortion rippled across the scanner grid exactly where he had aimed us. A thin shimmer like summer heat over an Arizona highway. The gunner froze. Reed did not. Now, he said. Manual gun 3 fired one clean pulse into the empty lane, not at the visible contact, not at the bait, but at the gap behind it. The display flashed white. The closest enemy signal vanished from our sensors, replaced by a spreading cloud of harmless static. No explosion filled the screen. No dramatic fireball. Just a tactical mark turning into silence. That made it worse. A weapon we could not see had just stopped being a weapon because a human veteran had remembered how fear behaves. Jero whispered, "That was impossible." Reed heard him. Of course he heard him. Humans hear everything at the worst possible moment. "No," he said. "That was math." I had never hated a calm sentence more. Colonel Varick stepped closer to the table. "They are adjusting." Reed nodded. "They always do after the first correction." First correction. Not victory. Not miracle. Correction. The language of a schoolteacher marking homework. The remaining contacts widened their formation, trying to stretch our firing arcs. The Iron Halo's automated system requested permission to resume control. Reed denied it without touching the console. The weapons officer looked at him, then denied it manually. That was the moment I realized the room had changed sides. 10 minutes earlier, we trusted doctrine and laughed at humans. Now the doctrine was blinking politely for attention, while every trained soldier watched one old man in a worn jacket. Captain Reed looked at us again. "You were told one human held the ridge at Black Meridian," he said. "That version was useful. Simple stories travel farther." No one interrupted him now. Even the alarms seemed quieter, like the ship itself wanted the rest of the sentence. "There were 212 Marines at the start," Reed continued. "By the final hour, there were 38 still able to stand post. The enemy believed that meant the line was about to fail." He paused, watching the formation outside, not the memory inside. That was their mistake. Jero's voice cracked slightly. 38 held the ridge. Reed shook his head. 38 held the door open. My translator rendered the words perfectly, and somehow I still did not understand them until Colonel Varick closed his eyes. Reed tapped a new command into the table. A sealed tactical map unfolded, showing old Meridian terrain, evacuation corridors, civilian shelters, orbital lanes, and a single narrow ridge between all of it and disaster. "The goal was never to win the ridge," Reed said. "The goal was to make the enemy commit everything to the wrong place." The incoming ships shifted again, and suddenly I saw the shape of it. They were doing what they had done before. Testing fear. Forcing movement. Chasing reaction. But Reed had not come aboard Iron Halo to tell us an old story. He had come because the enemy was trying to repeat one. Reed pointed at the center of their formation. "They think you are the trapped force." He gave the smallest, saddest smile I had ever seen. "They still do not understand humans. We do not build myths around traps we fell into. We build myths around traps we survived long enough to close." Captain Reed did not raise his voice when he gave the next order. That bothered me more than shouting would have. Shouting belongs to fear. Calm belongs to people who have already decided the shape of the disaster and found a place to stand inside it. "Open a narrowband transmission," he said. The communications officer looked at Colonel Varick first, because that is what sane personnel do when an old human asks to talk to ghosts at close range. Varick gave one sharp nod. The channel opened. Static filled the room, layered and dry, like sand dragged across glass. Reed stepped closer to the microphone. His reflection stared back from the black surface of the tactical table, older than the young man in the Meridian record, but somehow less worn by age than by recognition. "This is Captain Mason Reed of the Terran Marine Corps," he said. "You are approaching a coalition medical and training carrier under protected status. Change course." The static changed. Not words. Not yet. Just a pressure in the signal, a rhythm that made my translator hesitate. The remaining contacts slowed by a fraction, then spread wider, forming a half circle around the Iron Halo. Our tactical system marked it as encirclement. Reed smiled without humor. "There it is." Lieutenant Sarin asked, "There what is?" Reed pointed to the outer curve of the formation. "They want us to believe we are surrounded." Jero stared at the display. "Are we not?" Reed looked at him. "Son, being surrounded only matters when every direction is worse." It was such a human answer. Simple. Annoying. Almost stupid until your brain caught up and realized it was not stupid at all. Colonel Varick leaned over the table. "We have no clear exit lane." "We do," Reed said. They just left it behind us because they assumed we would never reverse into a threat shadow. The navigation chief made a strangled sound. Reverse a carrier this size during contact? Reed nodded. Slowly. That is not evasive. Correct. The word dropped into the room like a brick. Reed was not trying to evade. He was trying to make the enemy commit to the wrong picture. Again, the communications channel hissed, then formed a voice through our translators, cold and uneven. Meridian Witness recognized. Every soldier in the room went still. Not because the enemy spoke, because it knew him. Captain Reed placed both hands behind his back. You kept records. The voice answered after a pause. We kept warnings. That was when the human myth fully changed shape in my mind. We had thought humans told those stories to inflate themselves, to make their little bodies seem larger against the dark. But the thing outside, the thing maneuvering around our carrier with old caution and fresh arrogance, had kept the same stories for a different reason. It had kept them as hazard signs. Reed glanced at Colonel Varick. Now, the colonel gave the order. The iron halo reversed. Not fast, not heroic, just a massive carrier sliding backward through its own sensor shadow while every enemy contact adjusted too late. Manual Gun 2 fired at an empty coordinate. Manual Gun 5 followed. The display flashed, with clean white pulses and broken target locks. No chaos, no spectacle, just a chessboard turning over one square at a time. The half-circle collapsed into confusion. Our automated system tried to recalculate and failed politely. Reed did not fail. He kept naming spaces before they mattered, kept telling gunners where fear would move next. And one by one, the enemy formation stopped looking like hunters and started looking like students in a class they had already failed once. Jero whispered. The myth said he scared an empire. Reed heard him again. He kept his eyes on the screen. No, he said softly. We taught one to count humans correctly. By the time the last enemy signal faded beyond the iron halo's outer range, no one in briefing room 7 cheered. That is the part nobody puts in recruitment stories. Victory does not always arrive with raised fists and bright music. Sometimes it arrives as a room full of trained soldiers staring at a quiet screen, suddenly aware that they survived because an old human remembered how terror makes mistakes. The red lights shifted back to amber, then to white. The carrier's deck stopped trembling beneath our boots. Systems reported stable shields, minor hull stress, no boarding breach, no casualties. The words should have felt comforting. Instead, they felt too small for what had just happened. Colonel Varick stood beside Captain Mason Reed and looked 10 years older than he had at the start of the briefing. Reed looked exactly the same. Tired, calm, mildly disappointed about the coffee situation. The communications officer replayed the final enemy transmission because military minds are very good at touching hot surfaces twice. The translation was short. Meridian Witness confirmed. Engagement declined. That was all. No threat. No promise to return. No dramatic vow. They had come hunting a carrier and left because one human name turned a tactical equation into a bad memory. Jero sat down slowly, even though no one had dismissed him. His face had lost that bright recruit arrogance that had filled the room earlier. I recognized the look. It was the expression every soldier gets the first time the universe removes a favorite assumption. He looked at Captain Reed and said, very carefully, Sir, how many of the stories are true? Reed picked up his empty cup, turned it once in his hand, and gave the most human answer possible. Depends who told you. Jero nodded like that helped. It did not help. It made everything worse. Lieutenant Sarin asked the question the rest of us were too embarrassed to ask. And the versions we hear? Reed looked toward the display where the sealed Meridian files had closed themselves behind clean white security walls. Those are the polite versions. I thought about the barracks laughter. The jokes about tiny Earth soldiers. The way we had treated human legends like inflated campfire nonsense from a species too soft to survive, without attitude and hot sauce. We had been wrong in the most dangerous way possible. Humans did not make myths because they needed to look larger. They made myths because the full reports did not fit inside ordinary courage. They trimmed the edges. They softened the numbers. They turned horror into lesson, lesson into story, story into something a recruit could repeat without shaking. Colonel Varick dismissed the room, but no one moved for several seconds. Then soldiers began filing out in silence, passing Captain Reed the way people pass a monument they did not realize was sacred until after they mocked it. Jero stopped near the door and straightened. "Captain Reed," he said, "I apologize." Reed gave him a small nod. "Learn faster next time. Not cruel, not warm, just human." We never laughed at their myths again. Not because humans demanded respect. They rarely demanded anything. That was part of the problem. They held doors, fixed machines, shared snacks, said please, apologized when they bumped into armored soldiers 3 times their size. And then, when the universe cornered them, they became the reason old enemies kept warnings instead of trophies. Years later, when new recruits asked me whether human battlefield legends were exaggerated, I told them the truth Captain Reed taught us without ever raising his voice. Yes, they are exaggerated. They are exaggerated downward. The galaxy did not invent myths to make humans. Sound impossible. The galaxy invented myths so the rest of us could sleep.